Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Happy to be joined by longtime friend, fairly recent to the show, but a strong contributor, Robert Koshu. Robert, how you doing today?
Good, Don. Thank you.
Good to have you. Barbara and I were just talking off podcast, even though we've known each other for a number of decades. We won't specify exactly how many. And he's been participating in both A Fork in Time and The Room Where It Happened. This is the first time we've done a solo episode. Robert was a guest on a couple of episodes that had other guests. And then, of course, he's been on the two shows in various forms there. He's done independent episodes with Chris Coppola, but he hasn't done one with me. So we wanted to set this one aside just for us. And it's a topic that we share some history going back to. In fact, when you and I first got to know each other, it was about the time that this league, this incarnation was coming into being.
Yeah.
Which tells you how long ago that was. And but then, the things that have happened since. So, Robert, you want to set up our topic for today?
I will. And I'd ask Don if I could do something real quick, because part of the reason we wanted to do this episode, and I wanted to hop on it so quick, is I have, through familial connection, a unique perspective on alternative football leagues. So just to set it up, and I'm going to do this super, super quick. My youngest son, Cameron, he spent 3 years with mine and Dom's alma mater, the University of Houston, on their equipment staff. When he graduated, he jumped to 1 semester as a grad assistant with Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Left there, joined the XFL, the 2020 version of the XFL, on staff with the Houston Roughnecks. He left there. He has spent 2 seasons from 2020 and 2021 football seasons with the Green Bay Packers on their seasonal staff. In last spring, the spring of 2021, I got to get all my years straight here. He spent some time with a group led by a guy named Brian Woods with the Spring League. And then this past spring, 2022, he was the head equipment manager for the Philadelphia Stars for the 2022 version of the USFL. He was part of a group called Major League Professional Football, tried to start up in Mobile. We won't even talk about that. It was not a good experience for him. But so because of his spending time in those leagues, I kind of have kept up with what's going on in alternate football, mainly because I'm trying to make sure my kid stays gainfully employed and off my payroll.
Understood.
Don understands this. So that being said, we're going to set up. So for A Fork in Time, we are going to set up what would have happened if the USFL, the 1983 to 86 version, had succeeded.
Okay.
And stayed around.
And so we have to be careful about, again, specifying which version of the USFL, because the name was floated for. There have been a number of quote unquote rival leagues to the NFL, which has been the long-standing league, and we'll talk about those, I'm sure, as we go along the fork here, because we'll talk about similarities and differences among the various leagues. But there was an earlier incarnation of the USFL that never really took the field.
Yep.
There was the 80s version of the USFL, which definitely did take the field, and then there's now the current version of a USFL, if you will, in the 2020s, that also has taken the field. Each of them, with certainly the two that achieved, some semblance of actually becoming something real, very different in terms of what they were, in terms of what the modern USFL is now.
The modern USFL, other than having the actual names of the teams and the thing, that is all they have in common.
Right. And so I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go through. Now, we will along the way, I'm sure, mention things like the AFL, the American Football League, which eventually merged with the NFL to be the NFL that we know today, with the NFC and the AFC as conferences versus leagues. There was an earlier version of the XFL, which is circa like 2000, 2001.
2001. I was trying to remember
Yeah,
exactly when it was.
Yeah, that being well known for
Not being football.
Exactly, and McMahon of wrestling fame being the money and the mover behind that, but getting a contract, and then an XFL version that was impacted by COVID in 2020, which I think we'll talk about as well.
Yeah.
But again,
yeah.
Our focus today, I mentioned all that to say I know that we'll go to those various places, and there's a lot of different leagues, because I'm sure we'll talk about the similarities and the differences between what Robert described there as alternative football or rival football leagues to the traditional
NFL.
NFL
that
have gone through time. We're going to primarily focus on our fork around the early 80s version of the USFL. So when I say USFL to you, meaning the 80s version of the USFL, Robert, what pops into your head?
Houston Gamblers and Jim Kelly.
And both Robert and I, of course, are native Houstonians. I think most of our listeners know, and that's the first thing that pops into my head are the Houston Gamblers. By the way, the Houston Gamblers did not play in the first year of the league.
That is correct.
They technically were an expansion team, but not an expansion team. We can even get into what that's all about, because I think it does play with the founder of the league. But this was a rival upstart league. And the reason the Gamblers, I think, are well known to Robert and I, of course, we grew up in Houston, but at that time, the NFL team in Houston, the Oilers, before they eventually moved to Tennessee and became the
Titans,
the Traders, the Titans. I'm sorry, did I say Traders out loud? I didn't mean to. Before that whole exercise, which happened 20 years later, is the Houston Oilers in the early 80s were really bad.
Well, they were really bad, and they had a bad owner.
Yeah,
most NFL owners, when they ask cities to do things, and then the owner says, "We're going to move the team if you don't help me," the city acquiesces and does whatever the owner wants, expands the Astrodome, does whatever. When Bud said, "If you don't do anything," Bud Adams, the then owner of the Houston Oilers, this was several years after the USFL, but just kind of set up how badly he was viewed. When Bud said, "If you don't do this for me, I'm going to move the team," it wasn't, "Oh, what can we do for you, Bud?" It was, "What time do you want us there to help you load the trucks?"
Yeah,
so,
it was not a good thing. And this is between, for those of you that know football, and I know this is a history podcast, so some of our listeners may have already tuned out because it's already a sports episode, but this is after the late 70s and up through 1980 Love You Blue Oilers, which were a phenomenon here in Houston. And before the Oilers of the latter 80s and into the 90s, which became a perennial contender in the Warren Moon era, or Oilers, the Jack Pardee or Oilers. So it's between those two eras of NFL football here in Houston, and those early 80s Oilers, those 82 through 85-ish, 86-ish Oilers are bad. And so what happens is this new league forms, and eventually a team does come here, plays for 2 seasons in the USFL. And because the existing NFL franchise was so bad, and the excitement of the style that was played by this USFL team, the Gamblers, who the run and shoot style, pass happy, open offense.
Jack Pardee was their coach.
Exactly.
So it was all set up to be
wide open. Eventually he will go on to coach our alma mater, University of Houston, and Heisman Trophy winner Andre Ware there, the run and shoot. But it was a very exciting brand of football, winning football. So it had 2 things going for it. They were winning games, and they were exciting to watch, neither of which the existing NFL franchise could check the box for at that particular point in time.
Correct. Very correct. So let's kind of start talking about, so you can't talk about the USFL, the 1983 version, without talking about David Frank Dixon.
Yeah. He's the brainchild.
He is the man. And he was an antiques dealer in New Orleans. And he kind of came up with the idea that, hey, he thinks we should have spring football. Now, before he did that, he actually helped bring the NFL into New Orleans with the Saints. He also was a big piece of having the Superdome built. He actually was involved in the championship tennis piece beforehand. And then when he got started, he came up with a plan. He just didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I want spring football. He started putting the idea together in 1980. And by then, several things had occurred. The first thing of which is that the technology for field maintenance, either through artificial or natural grass, had evolved to the point where baseball and football could share stadiums year round.
Right.
That was actually one of the big things. He also figured out that, hey, there is an appetite for spring football when the NFL wasn't playing. So he sat down and he figured out, and he had a plan. And the plan was limited expenses, X number of franchises. And then after that, it was be prepared to absorb several years of losses in the beginning. And I found most interesting, they had to have a $1.5 million letter of credit sitting there for emergencies.
Right.
Every owner had to.
He had what was referred to as, and we'll use this term throughout, the Dixon plan. There was a plan. He had realized the recognition that there was a market that this could be sold to, not just in the sense of the markets that they would go to. That's an interesting part of the discussion I know that we'll have as we move through here, but that there was a market for this. There was an appetite for it. I think the only other thing I would mention that is supplement that, Robert, is there was an expanding cable television universe, which meant that, we think ESPN now, and we think what ESPN does, and ESPN being, fully owned by ABC and all of that. But this is back during the period of time when ESPN is showing, well, we're showing lumberjack competitions. We're showing other types of things that might not have been, because they did not have the relationships with Major League Baseball, with the NFL to have the major sports presence. And so the recognition was they had an appetite for programming. Spring football could be met by that appetite for programming. They could afford that compared to competing for a contract for the NFL or Major League Baseball, the other things that they would eventually do. And so Dixon not only had a plan that related to how this would work with the financials, and we'll talk a lot about the financials, I think, as we go through this, for the local markets being able to meet their bills by putting tails in the seats in the classic sense. But there was also the recognition that TV money could come from a source that wouldn't have existed, say, 10 years before.
Yep. And those two deals yielded roughly about $13 million in 1983 for the first season for the league. So they were spreading that around. And like you said, ESPN was 4 years old at the time. And I mean, Don, I don't remember if you remember, but we got cable at my house 81, 82. I mean, cable TV was not a big thing yet. That's when it was first coming in. So people were beginning to look at it and looking at this thing. And then all of a sudden, this ESPN league has USFL football. What is that? What's a spring football? Oh, they're going to play football in the spring. Gives me something to watch. Particularly if you're a football guy, you live, breathe, and eat football. And so you're ready for year-round football as it goes.
Yeah.
And so at this point, now he's got that. And to show you what ESPN's investment in the league was, the ESPN president was actually the league's first commissioner.
Right. This was, in many ways, it was a made for TV football league, but not with that being the only mechanism, if the Dixon plan had been followed, for the league to be solvent. They were made for TV, and the TV was going to make it work, but he realized that those dollars could be fickle, and they needed to have a strong, as you mentioned, the expectation was you had $1.5 million line of credit per team to deal with the fact that expenses arise. Emergencies happen in this situation. You've got to be prepared to deal with them, and a league, more than anything else, needs consistency and sustainability. That's actually going to be the downfall of the USFL in the real world, and we'll talk about what that is. But this was a unique time in the sense that while there had been other rival leagues, the most common being the AFL in the late 50s, early 60s is when it arises. The difference there was plenty of places where there wasn't NFL football. and there still is plenty of places even today where there's not NFL football, but it was much easier for the AFL to expand because they could go to large cities that didn't have an NFL team. The USFL was smart in the sense that it went initially to cities that did not have an NFL team, but it also did compete Houston, Chicago, New York, New Jersey, Los Angeles.
It put some teams in major league cities, and that actually cost them, because part of the problem they had was the NFL came behind them and blocked some of their stadium pieces where they couldn't get what they needed.
And they needed to have teams in those larger cities because of the TV aspect of things for rating purposes. So all of this was playing together. But Dixon introduces the league. And again, you hit most of the highlights of his plan. First of all, some of the things that we are very familiar with today were essentially USFL creations. One of those was a salary cap.
Yeah. He was like, we're going to have a cap. You can't pay more than X number of dollars for all your players. That was actually one of his biggest pieces is, trying to manage that as a way to manage those costs.
Right. The other thing was, if I recall correctly, and remembering reading on this, they had this idea of around like regional affiliation, so that the idea that college players who were not drafted by the NFL, I don't remember exactly how this worked, but the USFL franchises would have some ability to draw upon the regional aspect of those athletes in a way that obviously those would be recognized names in their regions, and in theory would draw fans, right?
Yeah, it's considered a territorial draft. It was later used by Alliance of American Football, which was another league that actually made it through half a season before it blew up and got really ugly. And that group actually followed that because, and like you said, Don, the idea was those kids who barely missed an NFL franchise, basically the team in that area got first dibs on them.
Right.
With the draft was kind of the idea.
And another thing to remember here that's a little bit different about, again, I know we'll constantly be referring to the NFL and the USFL. We just can't help but do it because of the nature of what's going on here. Is that the NFL, if they never sell a ticket today, if there's never a butt in a seat, are okay because they have this massive television contract. And the way that they have chosen to do that now for 50 plus years, that revenue is split equally across all of the teams, meaning that Green Bay gets as much money as Dallas does, or as the Giants do, or wherever the Rams are playing now, since they've moved around so many times back in LA. But that they shared the revenue from the television equally in the NFL in such a way that gave a financial cushion. The USFL did a similar thing in how it was designed as well, but the NFL was not dependent upon ticket sales for the stadiums to survive. Right.
Yeah. Butts and seats. They could survive. The USFL, even though they got the 13 million for that year one, they still needed, because part of it was they had the other part of the Dixon plan, we covered a couple of them, was they wanted to play in a large NFL caliber stadium, which I think was something we could talk about. They also had a large year one preseason marketing budget,
right,
to try to introduce the whole concept of this to their respective cities,
right. And so this is how things are sitting in leading up to what is going to be their inaugural season, which is 1983. So how long did the Dixon plan? Now we're reaching our point of our departure, our fork in time. How long did the Dixon plan last in its effectiveness?
One last thing. The plan called for first year attendance of 18,000 per game.
Okay. Let me put that in context. I happen to live less than a mile away from a local high school stadium that was built in the district that Robert and I grew up in. They moved where the stadium is. It used to be closer to where you and I grew up, and now it's closer to where I live. I think that stadium, if my memory serves, seats 8,000 to 10,000.
I think that's right. I've been to it once or twice for band competitions with the kids, so I think that's correct.
And at the time that it was built, this was in the early 2000s. And just incredible. The high school stadium had video replay boards and all the stuff that it had there, the things you were accustomed to seeing. And some NFL stadiums didn't have this as well as it does here. I mentioned that to say that is no longer the largest high school football stadium, even in the Houston area. It's been outmoded by others in the Houston area, outmoded by others in the state. It's still a quality stadium, still a whole lot different than the stadium that we watched our local high school team play in, which was, 1/10 the size. The point that I bring up there, though, is Robert, in the state of Texas alone for a high school football game, you can draw 8, 10, 12,000 fans on any given Friday night to establish programs and establish stadiums just for high school football.
I want to say Allen seats close to 20. Allen High School up in the Dallas area. If I remember their stadium numbers correctly, they seat close to 20. I know that the Alvin football stadium that they just built right up here by me off of Highway 288, I want to say it's somewhere around 10 to 12.
And the reason
you could
and the reason I make that reference is the fact that 18,000 fans for a professional football game in a major city is not an unreasonable attendance that you need to achieve.
No.
This is very manageable.
No. Well, the easiest way, if anybody watched any of the XFL from 2020, or if you watch mine and Don's alma mater, the University of Houston on TV, that would be approximately the seating at the bottom level only of TDECU Stadium.
Right.
So you're talking, you would fill half our stadium, basically.
Which is not, by normal standards, a large college stadium.
Yeah, no, our stadium's only 42,000. So that's a relatively small stadium. So we'll start trying down. So how long did it last? Well, let's start. I brought that out because in year one, 10 of the 12 teams exceeded that threshold.
Right.
So, but before the thing even started, the New Jersey Generals decided they weren't going to play. So they signed the Heisman Trophy winner from the University of Georgia, Herschel Walker, to a 3-year contract of $4.2 million. Wait
a second, Robert. I'm confused. You said 3. How much over how many years?
4.2.
Okay.
3 years. So 1.ish.
1.2, 1.1-ish, 1.2-ish. I thought each team could only spend $1.8 million.
1.8. Oh, and he got $1 million signing bonus to boot.
All right. So how did that work?
Well, that began immediately impacting because then all of a sudden, everybody else started drafting expensive players. Craig James, Anthony Carter, Calvin Bryant. This was just in year one, by the way.
Right.
Everybody started hopping all over some of these other players, and they started going for the marquee players. So they pretty much threw Dixon's plan out. It didn't. I think the phrase "the ink was not yet dry."
I think that's a fair way to describe it.
I think the other part of it was too, he had trouble with a lot of the original people he had recruited to own, getting them in the right cities that they wanted them to be in. Right. And stadiums. They had a lot of stadium issues.
Yeah.
At the beginning.
And in fact, the Gamblers here in Houston ultimately did play in the Astrodome, but that was only because the local NFL team at the time, the Oilers, did not have the level of control over that venue that other teams in other cities had over those venues because of leases and other agreements that were in place. They could not keep the Gamblers out of the Astrodome. The Oilers couldn't, but that wasn't necessarily true everywhere else.
No. Matter of fact, so the Boston franchise, which was originally the Breakers, so they wanted to play in Harvard, couldn't close a deal. Sullivan Stadium, which was owned by the New England Patriots, were like, yeah, not happening. Fenway, the Red Sox said no. Alumni Stadium on the campus of Boston College also declined. No one really knows why they did. So they finally negotiated a lease to play at Nickerson Field, which is on the campus of Boston University. Now, it did seat 21,000 people. So you would make your 18 average. But even when they sold out, because of the players they had signed, they did not make enough money to break even.
Right. So the Breakers were broke because they did not break even. No pun intended by
Yeah,
the name all the way through there.
Yeah, all the way through.
And so you mentioned the Herschel Walker signing. This is important for a couple of reasons. This time, the NFL did not allow undergraduates
That is correct.
to be drafted. And so, for those of you that don't remember, great running back in college, good running back in the pros. Walker won the Heisman Trophy his freshman and then again his sophomore year, if my memory serves. Right,
I believe that's correct.
Back-to-back years. And so here he is, about to be a college junior. There's really nothing left for him to do at the collegiate level, and so the opportunity to except get hurt and not be able to make money in the NFL, right?
Right.
So
We've never seen that.
So his willingness to be drafted by this upstart league and signed, it wasn't like it was the USFL competing with the NFL, because the NFL, under its own rules at that time, could not have signed Walker to a contract. And the interesting thing about that contract, we're talking about, wait a second, they had a salary cap. Yes, they did. Most of Walker's contract was a personal services contract, not a football contract. So it was a loophole way around the salary cap that Dixon had in place. But to your point, Robert, the principles upon which the league was going to build its stability were being toppled before anything had ever even been hardly built.
Yeah. It was one of those. You ended up with a lot of interesting characters who decided they could make money. So let's talk about one of the more interesting franchises in there, other than the Generals. Everybody knows the Generals, but what most people don't realize was there was another franchise called the Tampa Bay Bandits.
Now, where did they get the Bandit from, Robert?
They were actually part owned by, lo and behold, Burt Reynolds from Smokey and the Band. This was 83, so we're talking. Don and I grew up wanting a black Camaro for lots of reasons, just because, Burt, that's what Burt drove in the movie. And at the time, Burt also had a very attractive female on his arm, Lonnie Anderson from WKRP. So you would sit down there, you would look down there, and there's Burt and Lonnie down on the sidelines running around. And this name will strike anybody who follows college football. Their head coach was a gentleman by the name of Lee Corso.
which also just reminds me all of a sudden how old I really am now.
I have to think about that too. But it's even funnier because Lee jumps in and they market like crazy, because they end up branding a brand of football called Bandit Ball.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to mention this book a couple of times. I highly recommend it. I'll probably put a link to, like, even the Amazon how to buy it in the show notes. A book called Football for $1, which is about the history of the league. And one of the things I remember, there's a whole chapter that sort of talks about the promotional aspect of what they did to draw fans into Tampa Bay. And they just weren't drawing 18,000. They were drawing 30, 40, 50,000 plus fans for home games there. They were giving away cars at halftime and all this other sort of thing. They were a force to be reckoned with in the league financially. And a lot of other owners looked and go, if I can get something like that going, man, I got something happening here, right? So there was an excitement even among owners they were trying to recruit, or the existing owners, to try to keep up with the Burts, if you will.
Yeah, well, they were doing that. And then you have on top of that, now you've got Herschel signing. So, let's say everybody else kind of plays along and stays with the Dixon plan, so because the Bandits didn't sign anybody crazy, they more or less stayed the plan. So if I remember correctly, if I remember when I looked through the money, they actually came very close to breaking even that year.
Right. Which, by the way, for most new businesses, you don't make money.
No,
you assume in the first few years you're going to lose money. If you break even, that's just gravy, because you're in this for the longer haul. So the idea of making money in year one wasn't even a requirement under the Dixon plan. It's a nice thing if it happens, but that's not even what it's not what the pro forma was when you laid this thing out. You don't need to do that to have sustainability, because of the way you've designed things to move forward.
Yeah. So they do that. So we end up into the 84 season. So 83 kickoff, modicum of success. They actually made enough noise. And then the second part of it fell apart. because
One
of
of,
the finances.
one other thing real quick, Robert, just to mention, in addition to exceeding the attendance goal that they had set,
Yep.
the TV ratings were better than what they had set
Yeah.
as their threshold as well.
Yeah. Because they actually had a contract with ABC for one game a week too.
Right.
And so part of what was happening is kind of the opposite of today's world. Network TV was driving people to cable because people were watching a game, say New Jersey and Tampa. Hey, I like that Tampa stuff. It's pretty good. Well, they're not on next week. Where are they? What's this ESPN network?
Right.
Which I'm going to bring back up the ESPN connection much later as kind of another, because there's a whole thing working here with that. But yeah, it so they drive people there. So year two, the TV guys re-up.
Right.
For them.
Yeah, but because they had delivered the ratings numbers again, the vacuum that they were, and again, remember the time they're playing in before baseball comes into its full swing. It's the NBA is big, but it's about the only thing that's really going on moving into its playoffs in the latter part of the spring and into summer. So they're filling this void both on TV and filling this void in the sports calendar.
Yep.
And filling football void, obviously, most importantly.
Yeah. And this is just to kind of give everyone a little setup on the NBA. This is pre-Jordan.
Right.
Jordan had just started in the league, so he's not Michael Jordan.
Right. This is the Celtic Laker era of basketball for the most part. So, NBA is on the rise, but you're right. It's not the Jordan NBA that we'll see in the, beginning in the mid 80s and into the 90s there that changes that whole dynamic as well.
So it really is more of a sports vacuum,
right,
that you're existing in. That if you're looking for sports, it's early season baseball, the NBA, and that's kind of it.
Yeah, for those places that allow water to freeze and they do this thing where they play on it called hockey, that exists, but that's not a national sport, in the sense of the same way that the other sports that we're talking about are.
Especially not at that time.
Right.
It was really a northern sport at that time.
So sliding into year two.
So how did they fix the money issue? Well, you go raise revenue. Well, how do you raise revenue if you're a league with fixed attendance and fixed seats and things like that? You sell franchises.
Right. You get expansion fees.
Exactly. So that's where you do end up with the Houston Gamblers.
Now, the interesting thing about the Gamblers, this was something I actually learned, even though native Houstonian, knew the Gamblers. Now, I'm a high school student, so I'm not following all the financial list. The Gamblers are an expansion team, but Dixon, in the original layout of the league, had reserved a team for himself. That team eventually is sold to somebody else and becomes the Gamblers. But originally, the league was not looking to come to Houston per se. Dixon was not looking to come to Houston per se. He's a New Orleans guy. But what this team that he had set aside for himself as the founder of the league ends up being the team that lands here in Houston. And I had forgotten until we were doing the research, getting ready for this episode, that Houston did not play in the first year of the league. They were a quote unquote expansion team, a successful expansion team. But to your point, Robert, the existence of the Houston Gamblers brought money into the league, just like the other expansion franchises did.
Yeah, and by then, some of the other things are starting to happen where some of the stars move from Philadelphia to Baltimore. You have some franchises moving around. You have other people selling off their other franchises to other owners, because of different financial issues and, not really realizing that they didn't want to be a part of what they thought they'd want to be a part of.
Right.
They move through because, like you said, Don, pretty much at that point, everybody kind of throws it out, and they're like, we're going to have different financing than the original plan.
And then there are a number of what eventually will become well-known NFL players. Steve Young, for example. You mentioned Jim Kelly, who was the quarterback for the Gamblers, who eventually goes on to play in the league for the Bills.
Mike Rozier comes in.
As a running back going from Nebraska to Pittsburgh. So they are competing for not only in the unique Herschel Walker situation where, Walker couldn't go to the NFL even if he wanted to, and even if the NFL wanted him, but now they're competing for these guys that have a choice as they're coming out of college. I'm getting drafted by both leagues. Which one am I going to sign with?
Well, and for Steve Young, just so everybody's good, his contract was a $40 million guaranteed contract. So we have long waylaid the $1.8 million salary cap at this point.
So before we go off and really chase our fork, the ultimate fate of the league is that it starts imploding under these financial considerations.
So one of the expansion teams was the San Antonio Gunslingers. And there is some fantastic stories of the Gunslingers players and staff basically having this will really date me, gumball rally race to the bank
to cash their paychecks, because there was enough money to meet all the checks. They quickly discovered. Yeah.
If you were the first 10, you definitely got your money. After that, it was 50-50.
Yeah. And in fact, they were playing in the newly built Alamo Dome. To meet out the seating requirements. They put folding chairs out, that just so they could meet the seating requirements. Again, I strongly recommend the book. The book that I mentioned will give you a lot of flavor of this type thing. The other interesting thing that happens here, which is a part of that money coming into the league, which also is ultimately what leads to where it goes. We want to then come back and do what we do on a time, which is talk about the fork if it has succeeded. But one of the things is that team, the New York, New Jersey Generals change ownership. They get bought by this guy that most people now know the name of. At that time, he was sort of an up and coming name, but not what he is today. One Donald John Trump.
Yeah, he buys the Generals because Donald wanted to be an NFL owner.
Right. And he had made a run at the Baltimore franchise.
Correct.
Which eventually found its way to Indianapolis shortly after this period of time. And when he didn't get there, his whole reason for buying the Generals in the USFL was not because he wanted to own a football team in the New York area, but he had no intention of that team eventually playing in the USFL. He had the intention of that team playing in what league, Robert?
His entire plan was, we're going to move to the fall. We're going to really compete with the NFL. And we're going to force the NFL to take us, at least part of us, as part of a merger. Right. He wanted to play the AFL game, which Don and I had previously mentioned. The AFL runs from 65, Don, correct me if I'm wrong.
Actually before that, I think it's like 60, 61 or 62.
Yeah,
it's earlier than that, yeah.
And they run...
But they managed to get to the point of competing with the NFL to a degree that they're able to force the merger between the two leagues. In fact, the first Super Bowl is actually between the champion of the NFL and the champion of the AFL when they're still leagues, before they unite under the NFL banner a couple of years later and then convert themselves into
1960 to 1970.
Yeah.
So they actually survived 10 years.
Right. And we're a successful league. We're capable of going along. They as we talked about, I think a little bit off podcast, I think it was before we started recording, Robert, it reached the point where the NFL needed the AFL probably more than the AFL needed the NFL at that point.
You have to remember the NFL is much fewer teams than cities. And so the AFL comes mainly into cities where there are no NFL teams.
Right. And more traditionally, a lot of those fell in the western part of the United States, where the NFL had not expanded to. So there's the AFL. They're now in Los Angeles, but were the Chargers, which were the Los Angeles Chargers at the time. The Oilers were an AFL team. The team that eventually becomes the Kansas City Chiefs, which started play in Dallas as the Texans.
Yep.
There's a whole these franchises that are now NFL franchises came out of that AFL thing. And so when Trump buys the Generals, his whole plan is, we've managed to become successful enough. We're competing here. We're a rival league, and the goal of being the rival league is to reach the point of being absorbed into the league that I wanted to get into in the first place. And oh, by the way, the NFL had left itself exposed to antitrust considerations, which means that in addition to the financials of, can you leverage this situation, there was also the nature of, and if you don't do this, we're going to sue you anyway, which, by the way, they did. And by the way, the little known fact, the USFL prevailed in that suit. The reason
They won.
The reason that book that I mentioned is called Football for $1 is the damages that the USFL were awarded from the NFL were $1.
That was actually moved up to $3 because of the antitrust.
Oh, because of the
laws.
treble damages? Yeah. Treble damages are powerful, but you need a larger number to multiply by 3, right?
It's kind of like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah,
my other detour story, if I can, Robert, and then we'll swing back around, is that one of the things that in fact they led me to that book was, and again, we try to avoid politics here on A Fork in Time, but it's relevant. But the concept is, before there was the concept of the border wall, Doug Flutie was the border wall.
Yep.
Because what happened there was, in addition to, again, Flutie, Heisman Trophy winner, had gone, was not drafted by the NFL. So Trump signs Flutie to play for the Generals. Again, a large contract, more than he should have spent, actually more than he could afford to spend. And his whole point was, then he went to the other owners of the league and say, well, everybody can help. Everybody helps me pay for this guy because it's good for its publicity for the league. So this idea of I'm going to build a wall and somebody else will pay for it is that I'm going to buy Doug Flutie and all the league will now pay for it for me. So Doug Flutie equals border wall for those of you that are playing.
Yeah, there you go. That's a fair assessment. But so he does that. They try to move to the fall. That season actually never happens, and the league folds. And that is the real world.
That's what happened with apps in our fork, and now we will get over into the fork here. So the league exists for 3 playing seasons. Mm-hmm. Plans to make that transition. I think it was the fall of '86 is when they were going to do the transition.
That's correct.
And they merged some teams together. Ironically, the team that was the Houston Gamblers was going to became part of the Generals, became those 2 teams, combined together in this merger thing, but they never actually take the field again. So it's a short-lived flash in the pan, lots of interesting stories, brings some names that we know to light, brings football to some places that had success during that period of time, but it does not sustain itself. It's a flash in the pan.
Yeah. And it's a flash in the pan because it literally did not follow the plan. So let's go back. So it follows the plan.
Right. So now we're going down the fork. So our assumption is there's enough discipline or enough control for Dixon's plan to be followed.
Yep. So that means in year 1, nobody goes spending crazy. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think the TV revenue is enough with the fans they get in the stands, because ironically, Tampa Bay, who didn't go crazy with signings, had some of the best attendance, and part of it was, and we could kind of throw this, part of it was they had some very unique rules at the time that most people don't think about. So number 1, that little red flag that people throw out there, that actually came from the USFL. There was no replay. The NFL adopted it afterwards.
Right.
So that was one rule. And for those of us who are of mine and Don's age and grew up in the city of Houston, Renfro's feet were in, and instant replay should have happened way before it did in the NFL.
Right.
And so you're looking at it, and the USFL looked at that, and that actually had been cited as a reason for a replay. That play, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, 81 AFC championship game?
That was actually, I think that was the 70,
or was
78 or 79. Yeah.
Okay. Season.
But when our beloved Oilers of the Love You Blue era could not get past the steel curtain Steelers of the late 70s, And yeah, so there were innovations. They brought the 2-point conversion back, which had
Yeah,
been
that was the other one I was going to mention.
which had been an AFL staple. So this idea of, teams making a strategic choice, perhaps at points in the game, to go for the win versus go for the tie at risk there. So bring an air of excitement to the game. And a lot of the offenses were built around a much more open, throw the ball, high scoring. There was a lot less defense was not as prominent in the league as offense was, which made for exciting games. Maybe not as good a football, but in terms of the fan experience, a much more exciting brand of game.
It was an exciting game, but defense was enough that it was there. And I remember the USFL games and watching them and going, this is not bad football. It was better than some college. It was better than a lot of college. This is college before college became semi-pro football.
Right.
So it was a lot better than that. You had players who had been cut from NFL rosters. So you had people with real NFL experience playing. You had really good coaches out there. Jack Pardee, who ended up coaching the Gamblers in season 2. Jack Pardee was a junction boy from Texas A&M and had coached at the University of Alabama and had served on several NFL staffs. So he was not a flash in the pan. Corso had even at that moment, had a long history of coaching.
Yeah. Jim Mora, who I think coached the Stars, would later coach the Saints, among others, but was known in these were either established players and or coaches. George Allen, who had been well known from NFL days. I mean, they attracted not just names for the sake of names, but quality. And again, also remembering here that there's a lot of quality college football players who aren't quite good enough to reach the NFL. But again, if you will, these are quality college players who, when you put them on a field, don't look like slouches. They don't look like, semi-pro guys.
Yeah, they know what they're doing. They play good. They put good football out there. So I think the league makes it to League 2. So the question then, so we stay with the Dixon plan. Do they expand in year 2?
All along, expansion was part of the plan. That was part of Dixon's plan to do it in a smart way. And when you see, as you said, that the TV networks re-upped. And so I think what happens in a true alternative timeline where the Dixon plan is more there is they would have raised the salary cap. They would have had the ability to go, because it was valuable. Everybody sort of winced when the Herschel Walker signing happened, but it also gave some instant credibility to the league. So it's like, okay, yeah, this is outside. We can make an exception here because that's Herschel Walker. That's 2-time Heisman winner Herschel Walker. And oh, by the way, this was the NFL was almost sort of happy to have him go there, if I remember correctly, because otherwise he would have filed suit against the NFL.
That is correct.
To get early entry. And so it's like, we're happy for him to go over there because this doesn't open up the door, the Pandora's box we don't want to open up. So everybody sort of turned a blind eye to that. I think in year 2, year 3, you would have seen, again, under a more structured, maybe a harder, more fixed salary cap that was enforced in some way, you would have seen the expansion of salaries enough to attract some superstars, or you would have had what ultimately I think did happen in some of the other leagues. I'm thinking about the original version of maybe it was the North American Soccer League, but it may have been the MLS when it first came back. Each team was allowed like 2 exemptions from the salary cap. So you could sign 1 or 2 guys with some unique circumstances here, pay them money that was outside the norm, because it was sort of recognized as being marketing money more than being competitive balance money.
Okay. So we still expand. We do that. So now we go into year 3. And I think this is where it starts to get interesting, because I do think that at that point, I think some things come into play that I'm going to go with hurt the league a little bit. And it's because several of the guys who were invested and got caught up in the home savings loan pieces with with what ends up being the Resolution Trust Company and some other pieces. 3 or 4 owners got messed into that. The San Antonio team, if they come about, I think they still struggle because that was an oil deal with an oil crash,
right,
that hits them. And so I think some of the finances start to fall apart.
Is the league at that point, though, because they've been smarter in year one and year two, is the league strong enough to be able to absorb that and manage that so that it doesn't bring the league down?
I think so. I do think it survives. And then the question becomes, how does the NFL approach it?
Yeah. And in my mind, when I was thinking through, because we didn't even talk about what our fork was going to be till right before we recorded, we settled on the Dixon plan being held to right off the bat. In my mind, there are three possibilities. I'll go from least likely to I think most likely. The least likely is this thing called spring football is just spring football, and it continues to be what it is, and it's an entirely different thing that grows to be what it is. Whether it ever rivals the NFL, I don't know, over a period of time, but it continues to be its own animal. It's just,
Okay.
That's what it is. The USFL is in that realm. That's the niche that they, in the spring we have the USFL, in the fall and the winter we have the NFL, and everybody's happy and everybody can live with that because they're not directly competing with each other. And the USFL is willing to be what it is until it can grow to whatever it is, whether that's equal to, not as large, but still profitable and a worthwhile endeavor. I think that's the least likely scenario because it's America, it's a capitalist nation. People aren't going to be happy with just being the number 2 league or being the spring league when they can be something else. I think the other possibility is something along the lines of what eventually would have happened and did happen with like the Europe League, Europe, those types of things. What is sort of the case of the modern incarnation of the USFL? It's this thing that's actually subjected to in a sort of an extension of the NFL mechanism, where the NFL comes and says, you guys still play in the spring and we're going to help. We're not going to compete with you. We're even going to help fund you because you really are sort of a feeder into our product in a way that we want to recognize and we want it to be.
So let me talk about that one for just a little bit, that second scenario, because there's two things that are occurring with the 2022 version of the USFL. So I'm going to talk about the new modern version of it. So number one, hard salary cap. Number two, and this is where I think Fox Sports is taking a page from ESPN's playbook. Fox Sports is a 35 to 50% owner. I can't remember exactly which number it is because I've heard it bandied a couple of times in the USFL. In other words, they actually are part owners of the league as it exists. That league has been designed 99% for TV money.
Right.
The city of Birmingham made out like a bandit with their team, but it was really designed for TV money. They had a hard salary cap. However, let me give you the good news. So there's two pieces of good news. Number one, 52 players from that incarnation of the USFL have been invited to and attended NFL training camps. Okay. So it is literally a feeder league at this point, as you mentioned. Number two, part of that is the league was they didn't just break even, it was profitable.
Which means there will be a 2023 incarnation.
There will be. My son is anticipating, nothing is 100% guaranteed in today's universe, but he is anticipating being back as the head equipment manager of the Philadelphia Stars with 2 hubs. Last year they hubbed in Birmingham.
Right.
We're going to split to 2 hubs for sure next year.
So
if not 3.
So I can invest that's my middle scenario, is that it becomes some type of entity that's it's a competitor of, but not really competitor of, and everybody recognizes what it is and it goes there. The third thing is a variant of what actually happened in the real timeline that is differently successful in the sense that eventually they do reach the point of forcing some form of merger or some of the teams being absorbed in from the USFL to supplement the NFL, with the theory there being that I think there's an arguable case today. The NFL is big. The NFL is 32 teams now. There's a limit to how big a league can get and be reasonable in terms of professional league. But I think you could arguably make the case that there's room for maybe 36, maybe 40 teams. There's an upper limit, whatever it is. But there could have been or would have been room made for 4 to 8 teams coming out of the USFL as an incarnation and brought it in the NFL, mainly to fill niches and markets that the NFL was not in and wanted to protect. So if you think about expansion that did happen in the NFL after the
I was
USFL,
fixing to say
where teams either went because of moves, we mentioned the Colts and they moved to Indianapolis. Eventually the team expands into Jacksonville. Jacksonville, we know well from here in Houston, because that's one of the cities that Bud Adams played with and trying to leverage. I'll move the team to Jacksonville because they're big enough to support it. Tampa Bay did already have an NFL team, so it wouldn't have been there, but San Antonio. The argument can be made. LA at that time.
Baltimore. The Browns go to Baltimore, and the Browns is technically an expansion franchise.
Right.
The Cardinals moved from St. Louis to Phoenix.
Arizona, right?
Yep.
And then, for example, so after Baltimore leaves for Indianapolis,
yep.
Cleveland leaves for Baltimore, but in that period of time, the Philadelphia Stars during the USFL actually move over and fill in that gap.
Stores.
Yeah. Yep. And so I can imagine the scenario, and I think it's the most likely scenario, is some number, and I don't know what that number would be. At the time this is happening, the NFL is not 32 teams. It hasn't fully expanded. So maybe you get some of the expansion teams slots that we know today that built it up to a 32-team league, or maybe it's a 36-team league where those teams would have come not through expansion dollars, but through the merger dollars. The argument against that is that one of the things you mentioned earlier, one of the things that leagues do to make money and make money for everybody are expansion fees. Yep. And so the decision would have had to be made by NFL owners. Are we better off foregoing the one-time infusion of expansion fees in exchange for capturing markets that we didn't have? And by the way, we'll never be effectively challenged again by a rival league because we've got the whole country covered like we need to now.
Yep.
I think that's the more likely of the sort of the three scenarios that I laid out, is that eventually you do have a NFL USFL merger with some portion of the USFL team surviving into the new version of the NFL.
It's either that or the middle one, where they become the development league, which, by the way, so the other thing that's been different, so we're going to talk very, very briefly about the XFL 2020 version, the new version, not the McMahon. Well, McMahon owned both of them, but McMahon got smart the second time.
Right.
That 2020 version of the XFL, it was also designed as kind of a quote unquote development league, but their design was to sell seats in stadiums. And I can tell you, there were two teams who sold out like crazy. Number one was the St. Louis Battlehawks, was the name of the team. And the St. Louis Rams had recently moved to LA, so they were starved. And as most football fans know, our beloved Houston Texans are a dumpster fire of an organization. So Houston embraced the Roughnecks. They had, by the second game, they had opened the upper deck of TDCU, Don.
Right. And I watched a few of those guys. I know you went to some of those games live because I was following you on social media and the connection that you had there. Again, taking advantage of, very much like the gamblers were in the USFL days here, taking advantage of a void. But again, an exciting brand of football. And the other interesting thing to me about the XFL, which is also where it sort of ties there, they experimented with some new rules, the way that they handled kickoffs for injury prevention, and the extra point, the point after a touchdown configuration. I still can't remember all the details of that, but I think if you're willing to try a 180 yard play, you could have gotten 10 points or something like that.
There was, it was a 1, 2, or 3 point.
3 point option.
Yeah. With a run from, I think, the 10 or the 15 to get the 3 points.
Yeah.
You know, the standard kick, they had no kick.
That's right.
Run from the 2,
right.
Run from the 5, or run from the 10, if I remember correctly, from scrimmage.
And the reason I think it's interesting to bring that up, because this had already started to happen to some degree. You mentioned the rule change, which is an important part, is that while the NFL has been the dominant brand of American football, I know we have some international listeners here, and I know that there's a thing you call football that's a round thing, and that's, I don't ignore that it exists.
American football.
American football. The NFL has been the predominant form of American football for 75 years now, even as the AFL rose to prominence. But at various points as a game, it has reinvented itself either with the style of play, with rule changes, or with the technology changes that are now in play. I was actually watching a preseason American football game the other day, NFL preseason game. And for some period of time, the first down line, the superimposed digital line, was not functioning. And I realized I watched football for most of my life without that being in place, but to suddenly not have it there, it's an expected part of the technology now at any level of play. The innovations that came along, the USFL as more of a TV-based league, bringing replay into play, where actually the TV coverage of the game was a requirement to be able to have that as something you could do.
Well, and they did something different. The 2022 version of the USFL, they had a chip in the ball except for kicks.
Okay.
That was tracking digital first down.
Yeah.
Tracking. And which by the way, the original XFL, the crazy XFL, did bring one thing into the world: flying cameras.
That's true. That's true.
That came from the original XFL. So, but they were using 2 in the NFL along with the drone camera.
Right. And so where I think that, again, going back to our alternate timeline here, is I think that the other thing that the USFL would have brought in that merged version is you would have seen an alteration, which happened in the NFL anyway, in response to the USFL, but you would have seen that being a catalyst for probably some additional rule changes, because I think what the USL would have continued to do over those couple of years before the merger or the integration of the two leagues, they would have continued to push the envelope with rule changes, technology innovations, or other things that by the time you get, I don't want to call it a merger so much as an integration. I think integration is a better way of describing it, because it would be a much smaller group of USFL teams that would be coming into the NFL. So that integration that would have happened would have integrated the 2-point conversion. It would have integrated instant replay, because that would have been a requirement, but it would have probably integrated 3 or 4 other things that we probably do have now that probably would have continued to be developed, because the USFL would have been, as the new upstart league, the ability to try these new things. If they were successful and people liked them, that would have been something that would have been expected to come in with those teams in their integration into the NFL.
And the difference between the XFL 2020, which I am going to throw out, totally different fork here, but that league I think would still have been around had COVID not happened.
I agree.
That league was full on moving to success. My son still wants his world championship ring from the XFL because he is convinced that the Roughnecks would have won. They had plans for the parade already, but that league and the USFL, the 2022 version, the biggest difference between them and the Dixon, and I will say the failure of the Dixon plan actually led to this occurring. The XFL and the NFL and the USFL, the newest versions, 2020 and 2022, as well as what's going to be the 2023 version of the XFL with Dwayne Johnson as a part of it. They are all owned. The league is owned. Every franchise is owned by a single entity. And I think the failure of the Dixon plan created that, because people are like, well, I'm going to make sure I can maintain control of this situation.
Yeah. The ultimate place that I went to, because in the period of time since I was graduated from high school, and soccer was this strange thing that I was aware of but didn't know. I've actually become more of a fan in the last 15 to 20 years of the beautiful game, the international game. Is that the real extreme place that I wanted to go is, I don't know if this could have ever happened.
Relegation.
I was exactly. I don't know if you saw it on my face and knew where I was going. I could have imagined a scenario where what actually got formed was, again, the USFL continued to exist as the spring league, but then there was a mechanism by which those teams could be promoted up and teams in the NFL could be relegated down. It's such a non-American professional concept when it comes to sports, but I'm intrigued by what that would have meant, and whether something like that, if the USFL, the 80s version of the USFL, had survived long enough with enough stability in the franchises so that only a few can come, which few can come? Well, the best can come. Well, if the best can come, what about these teams in the NFL that aren't doing what they need to do? Can they go? Can there be this two-way
The
thing?
Detroit Lions would be in the USFL today, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Along with the Texans.
Yeah, something like that. And, I don't think that would have come to be because, again, it is so non-American professional sports in its orientation. But if it lasts long enough that it lasts into the period of the rise of the English Premier League, the rise of some of the other things that go on in international soccer, such that some of those you're looking around going, how do you deal with when the situation when you have too many teams for one league, which is really what the problem becomes there in using the English football system being part of the problem. There is you can't have a league of 100 teams, but there's 100 clubs. And so one curious thing, I don't think it ever would have happened as the fort, but if the USFL had lasted as long as the AFL did in the 1960s.
10 years. So 1993.
It goes into the early 90s.
Yep.
I think you could have seen some thoughts there about how, and again, the rise of cable sports, there's more outlets for where these games can be played and can be shown that can be profitable. I think you could have seen, I think it's the rare fork here, but that could have led to some version of American football that has relegation with at least 2 levels of play.
Oh, and we were talking about this at my fantasy draft last night, and we're all in favor of it.
Yeah, I don't think relegation will ever come to American professional sports. Never say never, but I find it doubtful.
It would be hard.
It would be hard because it would, again, and what it would require, which is why it can be considered in a fort thing like this, which is a really strange way we've circled all around the forest to get here, is that it requires a scenario where the status quo is being so disruptive that you can open up the idea that there's other possibilities that exist. There's no possible way today that any of the big 4 American sports, as you want to identify them, would bring any form of relegation into play. First of all, because it's not in the best interest of the clubs that are already in the league to expose themselves to being demoted to a place that has, English Premier League being a great example of this, but is also true in other systems like this. The worst team in the English Premier League, the revenue they get from the TV money compared to the best team in the championship over there is an order of magnitude different, as I understand it.
It's the way I always think of the Power 5 versus the Group of 5 in college football.
In American college football, exactly.
It's the dollar number difference.
Yeah, there's a zero different, and that zero is left
2
of the
to 3 zeros differences,
and all of those zeros are left of the decimal, so they all matter. And and I think that would be the rare outcome. I talk about the 3 things. The 4th possibility that I could see is that combination of an integration, but that integration would also be congruent with a reformatting of American professional football in such a way that you sort of have at that point maybe there are 50 teams, 60 teams spread across these 2 leagues, the NFL, and because that one of the things that causes that to work, as I understand it from afar. Again, I'll use the English Premier League is the one I'm familiar with. I know this works similarly in other European leagues, La Liga and the Bundesliga and things like that, is that it gives a unique incentive to teams in that lower tier league to work to compete. And it gives a unique incentive to the teams that are in the Premier League, the tier above that, to continue to maintain in such a way that you could have 50 or 60 clubs, American football clubs, and there's a path for all of them to do what they need to do and who they need to be in such a way that would change the landscape. And because of that, again, there's plenty of TV revenue, plenty of TV outlets. In fact, that's not the issue now. Every game, every week is on someplace streaming if it's not on regular TV.
Yep.
And I can't help but think, again, now just on the fly here, the one other thing that could have been interesting, if it lasts long enough that you actually get into the period of time that we think of as being the internet era. This upstart league that had come into play because of television is still around. Now it has the ability to distribute itself through this other means of broadcasting its games and being out there. If the USFL sticks around for 15 or 20 years before the integration, then an entirely other thing might have happened. Probably not likely, but something else.
You end up there's some interesting things that occur with the internet as you look at it, because then you end up, there's actually an alternate league out there called fan-based American football, where people can vote on the plays to call in.
Well,
don't get me wrong, it is not a big league, but it is one of those alternate leagues that I've heard about and seen. And it's like, you're looking at, so does somebody go that crazy with it at that point to try to drive their league in?
So, Robert, did we miss anything big?
I don't think so. I think we got it. I do like the idea of either a development league where they finally eventually they become big enough that the NFL does see it as a problem.
Yeah. And I think there is a scenario where that integration and the feeder, you could have both.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could have had some franchises come over and the remaining franchises go into this, because ever since then, the NFL has been the Europe League, all the things that have come along. They wanted to have this way of taking those college players that might be capable of playing in the league, having a place for them to go, that where they still have a way to control them, and eventually they end up in their league. That's what that's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely so.
Yeah,
definitely so. I think we covered it, Don. I think, football is one of those in quintessentially American sports. And if you look at it from the world's perspective, it looks weird, but it works for us.
Right.
As Americans.
And again, I mentioned, the Premier League there in England. You also see now the flip of that happening, which is some of those concepts coming back over into how American leagues are promoted, because we are becoming global in that sense.
Yeah.
American football is a unique thing. And
the Green Bay Packers are playing in London this year.
There you go. And this little bitty town called Green Bay as a team in the elite level, or the elite league, which is there. Robert, I'm excited. This is our first chance, I guess, to promote this. We've been talking about it. It was mentioned on one of our other episodes the other day. We're going to do a live stream here.
We are.
We've set a date for that. Our target date is September the 22nd, which is a Thursday night. And just so our listeners know, the concept is it's come listen to us, talk to us live, chat with us in the chat box there. We'll answer questions. It won't be a classic episode per se of A Fork in Time or The Room Where It Happened, but a chance. By the way, people can throw history what ifs at us if they want to, and we'll give ideas there on the fly. But the idea is that we will expose our listeners, for those that want to show up to a live stream. You'll see some links in the show notes for this release here about where to go on the website. Go to the website. There's a place to RSVP. Come or don't come, but let us know if you're coming so we have an idea about what to expect, but also a place to go ahead and put your questions in for us to discuss on the live stream.
Right. And so, Don, I just want to throw out real quick. So I heard you mention something you hadn't mentioned before, Room Where It Happened. I want to tell our listeners what that is.
Yeah, Room Where It Happened is because we had so much extra time just laying around to do podcasts. We decided to start another one, A Fork in Time. And this was a slightly different Fork in Time that we spent a lot of time talking here about the what did. We did get into the what if. In the traditional Fork in Time episode, we spend more time talking about the alternate history. The Room Where It Happened is intended to be about real history and discuss real history events. And our concept there is taking a geographic place, the room, broadly defined, but the room where it happened. And then a lot of the same folks that you've come to know here on A Fork in Time, Robert being one of them, participate in the Room Where It Happened. We do those monthly, so they tend to be longer episodes. We don't feel as bad about going long there as we do with A Fork in Time. And then we talk about a real historical event. We're really excited. This is the other thing that I want to promote here. We're really excited about
I was hoping you were going to mention that.
Yeah.
I'm on 1953, halfway through.
Cool. We've had this, and we encourage our listeners all the time to reach out and interact with us through our website. And more and more folks are doing that. A lot of the folks that you've come to know that are part of the Fork in Time team were listeners who reached out with topical suggestions, came on to do a guest appearance, and we couldn't make them leave. There's the Chris Capolas and the Eric Rushes and the Eric Bonds of the world, who I'm glad have come that way. But we also have had more, I'm going to call them real history people. We know a lot about history, but we're talking about actual academics here. We had an opportunity. Someone reached out a couple of months ago. Dr. Bo Breslin is his name. He's at Skidmore University here in the United States. And basically said he'd love to do an episode. And the concept of his topic suggestion was around the idea of generational constitutions, which was something that Jefferson, who was not present to be part of the actual drafting of the Constitution, a lot of folks believe he would have advocated strongly for because of a letter that he wrote to Madison and those types of things. So we're going to be doing our first real big crossover between The Room Where It Happened and A Fork in Time. And we're excited about the fact we'll be doing those initial recordings here in the next couple of weeks. Dr. Breslin's going to join us for The Room Where It Happened episode, which will set up the concept here. He's written his book, which is on that. There'll be also a link in the show notes about that. And the concept is that the United States in its history goes through scheduled regular calling of constitutional conventions. And what would that look like? And so in his book, he actually goes through 5 of these conventions and what they might have looked like. And so our plan is here, and he's on board and he's excited to do it, which gets us excited at the same time, is do A Room Where It Happened, where we kick that off. And then we will do at least 3, maybe as many as 5, A Fork in Times, where we look at each one of those conventions that comes along that he outlines in his book and talk about those historical what ifs. So it's perfectly timed. September 17th is Constitution Day. And so we think we'll have those first 2 episodes recorded and in the public release schedule by then. And so we invite our listeners to come along and listen to those things. And we're excited about that. We're literally working on the logistics of getting those recordings scheduled right now, which is pretty cool. And so we want to promote that. You'll hear a lot about that over the next month, because we're have to, like I say, when a real history guy shows up and said, "Hey, I'd like to join you fake history guys for a little conversation," we sort of get excited about that, because we think it, I think it sort of classes up the place.
Like I said, I bought the book, and I'm on his one of his constitutional years is 1953, and I'm halfway through that year at that point. I made a joke with my boss at work that I was light reading on our anniversary trip, and my light reading was the Living Constitution book by Bo Breslin. And she looked at me and she's like, "That's light reading." I'm like, "It's not oil and gas, it's not leadership, and it's not technical training." So yes, that is light reading.
There you go. And by the way, the book is very good. I am not quite to that.
Very good book.
Yeah, because it's also told from the standpoint of a narrative approach to attacking these historical things. And I think he does a good job of balancing there. He's a good writer. If you go back and if you haven't already looked at some of the back catalog, we have some links in some of the episodes there to a couple of his appearances on C-SPAN and other places that you can link to. But we're excited about that. So in addition, September is going to be big in the sense of the live stream. It's going to be in September. In fact, we will already release those episodes. I'm guessing the live stream may actually some of the questions in the live stream may relate to that. And then we'll be doing the thing on the generational conventions, which we're getting excited about. And of course, we managed to get things sort of, a little righted here, a little more stable in terms of getting things out the way that we wanted to all the way through. Robert, this has been fun. I've been wanting for you and I to do an episode as a pair since this got started. So I appreciate you joining us today. And there's a part of me that will always wonder in this alternate history that we've just talked about, would the Houston Gamblers, who had found their way into the NFL, would they have actually brought home an NFL title? Because my Oilers never did, and my Texans haven't so far. So there you go.
I'm thinking they would with Jim Kelly around.
There you go. Now we're really talking about alternate history in terms of a Houston NFL title. Yep. Robert, thanks for joining, and we invite our listeners to join us next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.